Because so many people who don't believe in God spend the rest of their life trying to prove that God doesn't exist. Now, I don't know about you, but do you have any trouble with the tooth fairy? Do you have to spend your life proving that the tooth fairy doesn't exist? Why not? Because there's no such thing. Yeah? So if you have to spend your whole life proving that God doesn't exist, what you're really doing is saying, well, I do believe in God, but he's too inconvenient, so just let me push him into the background somehow. So, but I'm not talking about that kind of person. You know, where is God? I'm talking about the crisis of faith. I'm talking about people who are trying to learn about God, but still ask that question. Let me give you an example. Do you recognise that mountain? When I was a student at Longburn College many years ago, it was the custom back then, the tradition back then, to every year have an annual snow trip. And this particular year, a few of us decided, once we were at the mountain, to climb it. Because you had to be a millionaire to be able to hire skis, and we did not have the money required to hire skis. So we thought, let's climb the mountain. And there was a group of about 8 of us, some girls, some boys. And the good thing about Ruapehu, as you can see, is it's got a ski lift. And so you jump on the ski lift and you go up beyond the end of that, and then there's another ski lift that takes you further up, and then another one that takes you further up, and you can get right, a long way up the mountain doing that. But then it comes to the end of the ski lift and you have to start walking. Now, we did not have mountain gear. We really knew nothing about mountain climbing or whatever. So we just had our ordinary boots on and, So we started climbing. We climbed for a couple of hours. It really, started to get a bit strenuous. But the view, you can kind of see in that bottom right-hand corner, the view that you can see when you get high up onto Ruapehu, it is brilliant. And one of our mates was a photographer, and he had a bag of camera gear, and he was just leaning over to change lenses when all of a sudden he slips over the edge. And that's a high mountain to slip over the edge of, isn't it? And the air grew cold. And I thought to myself at that very point, where is God? Anyway, we'll continue that story later. So I would like to look at a few stories through the Bible of people who may have asked the same question that I asked on that day in Ruapehu up on the mountain there. And the first one I'd like to talk about is Abram. And in Genesis chapter 15, we meet Abram. This is before he became Abraham. He's about 85 years old, and about 12 or 15 years before, God had promised him a child, a son. And God says to Abram, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." But Abram's kind of scratching his head and thinking, hang on, Lord, you promised me a son and I don't have that son. Why are you my great... He just couldn't understand what God was saying. "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." This young boy that I got from somewhere, he's very helpful around the home, and perhaps he is the one that I will invest the family fortunes on when it comes time for me to die. And God said, "No, he will not be your heir," in verse 4, "but your very own son shall be your heir." And then verse 5, he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars if you can count them." Now, what time of day do you think this was that God took Abram outside? Well, you'd think it would be nighttime, wouldn't you? Because that's when you see stars. But it wasn't nighttime, it was daytime. Because in verse 12 it says, "As the sun is going down, And then verse 17 says, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, so God takes Abram outside in the daytime. Count the stars, Abram, if you can, and that's how many children you will have. And in verse 6, it says, then shall your offspring be, at the end of verse 5. And verse 6, he believed the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. In other words, Abram, as he looked up into that daylight sky without seeing any stars, does that mean that there's no stars when you look up in the daytime? No, they're there, but it's just the wrong time of day to see them. You've got to wait, in God's good time, the stars will appear. And as he thought about that, okay, Lord, you've said that I will have children as many as the stars. I can't count them, but there will come a time when I won't be able to count my physical children either. So that's why he believed God. So the story continues. It's a very fascinating story, and I won't spend too long on it. But God says, look, I'll show you why you can trust this. And he asks Abram to do a number of things. Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Cut these in half, set them out on the ground, and then wait for what happens next. But as soon as he does this, what happens when you, in that part of the world, what happens when you cut an animal in half and put the pieces on the ground? Vultures. You're not going to be very long before you have all this flock of birds coming. And this old man, he's 85, and he sees these birds coming on these animal sacrifice pieces. What's he going to do? He's chasing them. And as soon as he goes to that end to chase them, they come at this end. And he turns around to chase these ones away. And what happens over here? He's running backwards and forwards for a long time. But verse 12, as the sun was going down, what do birds do when the sun goes down? Time for bye-byes. And so they go. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. It catches up with him. He's an old man. He's been exercising. I don't know why he doesn't have a heart attack, but he's a tough old rooster, and he just falls asleep. He has a very deep sleep. And the Lord said to him, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they'll be afflicted 400 years, etc. And then verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. We see that flaming pillar of cloud and fire in the Exodus. That was what led the people through the wilderness. That's the presence of God. So what is the presence of God going between these pieces for? There's a number of evidences from the old ancient world, but in Jeremiah chapter 34 and verse 18, we see a biblical example of it. And this is where, in the old days, when you had to make a treaty or an agreement or something legal, they did what they call cut a covenant. In the English, it's translated make a covenant. But Jeremiah 34 and verse 18. The men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. Right? Just to put a little bit of extra on that, the Hittites, the ancient Hittites, the nation of Hattia, they used to have a treaty between a major superpower king and a little king that wanted to join the empire. And so the little king had to be down here cutting an animal in pieces, walking among the pieces, while the superpower king would sit on a platform with all these officials. And this little guy was saying, if ever I break this treaty with you, O king, you can cut me in pieces. It was a pretty serious kind of an agreement to make, wasn't it? And so that's what's happening in Genesis 15. But is it Abram that's going through these pieces, or is it God? What's the significance of God going through those pieces in Genesis 15? What God is saying to Abram, look, Abram, if you or your seed, your descendants, break this treaty between us, I will take the consequences and I will die. Wow, where have you seen that before? Yeah? Where did God die because of the failure of his people? Calvary. Yeah. Jesus was crucified to answer that problem in Genesis 15. Because God knew that Abram's people would be disobedient and unfaithful, and so he wanted to cover them to make sure that they have got a future. And without that, we've got no future. So where is God when God's timing seems slow? Where are those children you promised me, Lord? So sometimes these major events happen at a crossroads to show that God is still there, even though he's not working in the time frame that we're expecting. Right, let's push on. Where is God when you're running from your past mistakes? Have you ever done that? We all make mistakes. Do you run away from your mistakes in the past? Yeah, that's a pretty human thing to do. You know the story of Jacob and Esau, don't you? Genesis chapter 28. So the ancient tradition back then was that if there were a number of sons, the oldest son would be responsible for the family fortunes. It was called the birthright. But somehow this younger brother, Jacob, stole it from his older brother, and his older brother was so angry with him that he said, I'm going to get you, boy. You wait till our old man kicks the bucket, I'm going to be after you, and look out. And so Mum said, come on, boy, you need to run from your brother. He's too angry. It won't be long. He'll cool down, but you just flee. And so the story of Genesis 28 describes that fleeing. And he needs to run 1,000 kilometres. That's the distance involved in getting away from his brother. That's a long way to run away from your brother, isn't it? But if this angry brother is that angry, perhaps he needs to run that far. Genesis 28, verses 10 onwards, Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, 1,000 kilometres apart. He came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and laid down in that place to sleep. I don't know what kind of a sleep you'd have with a stone as a pillow. I'm not sure I would sleep, or at least I'd wake up with a headache. But this guy was bulletproof. You know, he could sleep on a stone, man. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth. Now, the Bible in the English says ladder, but the original word kind of suggests a set of stairs rather than a ladder, because it talks about angels coming and going, up and down. You can't do that on a ladder. You either go up or you go down at one time. You can't do both. So it's more likely a staircase. Now, that's not saying there's a staircase between earth and heaven. This is a symbol just to show us that the connection between earth and heaven is pretty secure, and God is there. So, and behold, the Lord stood above it in verse 13 and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. And so God is assuring Jacob that this land will be his. So this horrible running away from the past, God has still got a future for this humbug boy. And then a couple of chapters later, after he's got his wives and children and families and lots of flocks and herds, he's starting to come back to make some kind of reconciliation with his brother. Is it going to work or isn't it? So the same night as he's kind of going back to his brother, he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and set them across the stream and everything he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him. So just imagine this. Jacob is sending the 2 branches of his family in 2 different directions, so that if his brother comes and kills one half, the other half will survive. And then he's kind of thinking, and there's a man there. What are you doing here? It has to be from my brother. He has to be an enemy. He starts wrestling with this guy. But the more he wrestles, the more he realizes, hey, this is no ordinary guy. Especially when this guy touches his hip and the leg gets out of joint. Now, how many wrestlers do you know that can do that? One simple twist of the hand and your leg's out of joint. This is more than just a man wrestling with me. And he says, what's your name? I'm not going to tell you. and I won't let you go until you bless me. And this person said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with man and have prevailed. So Jacob, verse 30, called the name of that place Peniel, which means the face of God, because I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Again, at that time when he's kind of wondering, where is God? I'm getting into very dangerous territory. My brother's really angry with me. Am I going to survive this? Are my loved ones going to survive this? God is right there directing the traffic, so to speak. Right, so God is there when we're running from past mistakes. What about this one? Where is God when you are wrongly accused? You know who this is going to be about, don't you? Joseph is wrongly accused. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that he's not killed. Genesis 39, you know the story of the wife of the boss that he was working for. She thought that this was a great young guy to bed, but he wasn't going to fall for that. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke, this boy tried to do bad things to me. As soon as he heard that, he was very angry. What was he angry for? If he was angry about Joseph fiddling with his wife, there would have been no answer, there would have been no question. He would have taken out his sword and stuck it into this guy. But the fact that he didn't kind of makes me think that he was angry with his wife. Perhaps his wife had a bit of a reputation of dabbling with the pretty boys, Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison. What is the prison for back in the day? It wasn't for punishment. This was for just stick him in there until we just figure out what to do with him. And we know that two others worked for the Pharaoh. Pharaoh put these two guys in. One was the butler, one was the baker. And Joseph interpreted their dreams. Remember that story? And one was going to survive and the other one was going to be executed. So, Joseph was in prison not just for a few days while they were deciding, but he was in there for 12 years. How does that make you feel? What did he do to deserve that? He did not do anything to deserve that. And sometimes all the story tells us is that when we are wrongly accused, God is there and he's maintaining us, sustaining us, and he's got a better future for us. So in verses 11 to 22, we see especially at the end of this, the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. Incredible privileges given to this guy who didn't deserve to be in prison. So where is God when we are wrongly accused? He's right there, still blessing us in those circumstances. What about this one? Where is God when you are born into oppressive circumstances? And Exodus chapter 2. When I was newly married, or just before, I said to my beloved, I think we should have 12 children. She didn't say anything, but she looked pretty horrified. But when we had our firstborn coming home, and he stayed the first night home with us, I said to my wife in the morning, I think one's enough. This little guy, he would not settle. He would cry and whinge and carry on. And I'm thinking about this mother of Moses. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. How can she do that? When you've got a little monster that is roaring through the night like a lion in the jungle, how is it possible that nobody knows that this little kid exists? She was some mum, this girl, When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes, daubed it with bitumen and pitch, put the child in it, placed it among the reeds by the river bank, and his sister stood at a distance just to watch over it. Now, we know the story of the princess, the Egyptian princess that came down to the river to bathe. Now, I'm not sure why she was down there. This is not just a simple case of going to the bathroom, because the river Nile was a god. So was this a part of her morning worship as well as a part of her ablutions? Was it all mixed up in one big package? I don't know. But whatever the case, she somehow gets one of her girls to find this, she found this baby, takes the lid off, the kid's crying his eyes out, like little boys do. Well, I guess little girls do too, but anyway, he's being a baby, he's crying, probably got dirty pants, needs changing. And then big sister comes along, who's probably about 6 or 7, and she says, I can find a nurse for this baby if you would like. And you know the rest of the story. So when you're born into oppressive circumstances, what does that do for you? You might not think much of it at the time, but sometimes God uses that again as another transition point, a crossroads, where it can lead to incredible things that you've got no idea about. All right, what about the next one? Where is your God when you're trapped by countless enemies? And sometimes the world is pretty hostile out there, isn't it? And when you've got a lot of hostility being directed at you, where are you? Where's God, more importantly? Well, you could have guessed what story I'm looking at next. Exodus 14, verses 10 to 14. Listen to this. When Pharaoh drew near, so there he is in his chariot, racing after the Israelites who have just been released from Egypt, from slavery, but the Egyptians changed their mind. Hey, we shouldn't have done that. We need these people. Let's get them back again. So they come out with an army, and either side of the people of Israel is mountains. They can't go up or either way. And in front of them is the Red Sea, and behind them is the army. So what do you do when you're really trapped? All right, this is what you do. You whinge. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us to die in the wilderness? That's a good question. What have you done to us in bringing us up out of Egypt? That was a silly thing to do, Moses. You should have left us where we were. Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. We'd rather be in slavery than on our way to freedom. Have you heard that before? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And I love the answer that Moses gives. Fear not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. And the sea opened up, the Israelis went through it, and behind them was the pillar of cloud, which gave light in one direction and darkness in the other. And as soon as that cloud dissipated, because all the children of Israel were on the other side, then the army came through and God just let the water come back again, and that was the end of the Egyptian army. So, when we're trapped by countless enemies, that doesn't mean to say that God has deserted us. It just simply means life has taken an unpleasant twist, and sometimes life does that. We live in a hostile world. And everything that happens to us is not because God is pulling strings, but because there is a great battle, a struggle between the forces of good and the forces of darkness. And there are people, innocent people, caught in the crossfire of that all the time. Right, let's carry on here. Where is God when leaders threaten you? Oh, hang on, that's getting a bit personal now. But anyway, let's go. Elijah fleeing Jezebel. Elijah was an incredible prophet who had on Mount Carmel all of the prophets of Baal, who it seemed had kind of convinced the whole nation to follow the worship of Baal rather than the worship of God. I don't know how they did that, but they did it. And Elijah stood up and he said, okay, you guys, if you're so hot, make this altar of yours, put a sacrifice on it, and let your God answer by fire and consume your sacrifice. And I'll give you until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was about the time that he gave them. And for hours they ran around this altar, cutting themselves and calling out to the gods. Nothing happened. And of course, Elijah had to be very alert in case they smuggled in a bit of fire to set this thing going. And after a while, he just said, well, he might have gone to the toilet. Perhaps your God is having a bit of a sleep. Keep calling. And he was sort of mocking them a bit. But it didn't work. And then Elijah very quietly, without any fuss, set up his altar, sacrificed his animal, got buckets of water in a time of national drought, poured this water over these things, and then said, "Oh Lord, do your stuff." And down came the fire. So Ahab, the king, Ahab and his wife Jezebel, these were the ones that had encouraged this kind of false worship. But when Elijah caused the death of all of those false prophets, Jezebel was not happy. And what did she say in chapter 19? Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them tomorrow. You've killed all of my prophets, I'm going to make sure that you die." So he ran for his life. And when he ran 180 kilometers for his first step, for his first jaunt getting away from this woman. It's a long way to run. I don't know whether I could run 180 meters, let alone kilometers. He went by himself a day's journey into the wilderness, and he said, "It's enough, Lord. Take away my life. I'm no better than any of my fathers." And we read through the story, verse 9, he came to a cave and lodged in it. And then God said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Verse 10, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I'm the only one left, and they seek my life also." And God says, "Go outside and stand before the mountain." And the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke pieces of the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And God again said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "Oh, I've been," gives the same answer, "I've been very jealous and I'm going to be killed." And then God says to him, "Go back where you came, and I want you to do a few things for me. Anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, Jehu to be king over Israel, and I want you to anoint Elisha, a young man who's going to take your place. And by the way, Elijah, 7,000 people have not bowed their knee to Baal, so you're not the only one left." Sometimes we get the poor me syndrome. Even after the amazing spiritual highs that we have, the spiritual high on Mount Carmel for Elijah must have been incredible. But after a spiritual high, sometimes depression comes, sometimes we get really low, as Elijah did, and we get the poor me syndrome. And God just simply says, "Hang on, it's not as bad as you think." So another transition point, when Jezebel threatened Elijah's life, he thought that was the end, but it was really a new beginning. We need to recognize that too. God doesn't finish us, but he has new beginnings for us. Right, where is God when your loved ones are threatened? Who do you think that might be? I'm so glad that they have preserved photos from way back in Bible times. Isn't this a beautiful photo of Queen Esther? Well, she's some girl, isn't she? She won the beauty contest to replace the queen because the queen didn't please the king. You know the story. And in Esther chapter 4, got to find Esther, it's a hard book to get hold of. Somewhere in there. There it is, just before Job, and that's just before Psalms. Esther chapter 4. They lived in the Persian. They lived in the Persian Empire. The Persians were a very interesting people. They had what they called the law of the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were a tribal group that was more powerful than the Persians. But then the Persians slowly took over. And they had what they call the law of the Medes and the Persians. If a law was made, you could not do anything about it. And they found records, ancient records from this time, when somebody had been accused of a crime, and just before the execution they found out that this guy was innocent. But what did they do to him? They executed him anyway because the law had already been set. This guy needs to be executed. So even though he was innocent, because the law of the Medes and the Persians said it, he died. So there was a law that went out that all of the Jews would be killed. And Mordecai, the cousin of Esther, was so upset he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, which is a symbol of death. In those days you didn't have coffins, you were wrapped up in sackcloth, and you went from dust to dust, as the saying goes. So if you had sackcloth on and dust over your head or ashes over your head, and they do that in some parts of the world still today. It's an ancient tradition. This was a sign of death. And when Esther heard that her great cousin was dressed in sackcloth, you shouldn't be like that, bro, because you should be sitting at the king's gate doing your job as one of the legal experts of this country. And he wasn't going to hear it. He just went up and down crying through the streets. And she sent her messengers backwards and forwards, even with new sets of clothes, and he sent them back again. What are you doing? What are you doing, Mordecai? And he then sent to her a copy of this law of the Medes and the Persians that could not be changed. And she said, well, I can't do anything about that. For me to go to see the king, he has to call me, and he hasn't called me for over a month. So I don't know how I'm going to do this. And this is where this famous phrase comes from. Verse 14 of chapter 4. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. But who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And sometimes I say that to people that find themselves in horrible situations. Who knows that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? God has got a purpose for you to be here in the midst of these horrible things that are happening. So you know the story. She went in, she put on her best clothes, the best lot of perfume, and as the king saw her, his heart melted. Whew, flutter, the chemistry started working. Yeah, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And she said, can you just, after a series of events, you need to write another law to allow the Jews to protect themselves from the day when their enemies come to kill them. So, when your loved ones are threatened, is God there? Yes, he is. And sometimes he brings deliverance and sometimes he doesn't. But that doesn't mean to say that he's not there guiding you through it. All right, where is God when your world collapses around you? Has your world ever collapsed? Have you ever lost one very important thing in your life, probably a loved one, and you thought, where is God? If God loved me, why did this happen? Why did this beautiful daughter of mine die of cancer when she's only got a couple of small kids to look after? That's not fair. Why does God do that? Well, the quick answer is God doesn't do that. He's not the cause of sin and suffering. There's another guy that specializes in that. But where is God when your world collapses around you? The book of Daniel starts off like that. And as these guys are carted off into captivity, what have they lost? They've lost their city, they've lost their neighbourhood, they've lost their parents, they've lost their sisters to whoever knows what kind of fate that their sisters fell when the invading armies came through. They'd lost everything. They lost their names, they lost their religion, they lost their future, and they were probably castrated so that they could never have families for themselves, because that was a prophecy of Elijah concerning this time. So where is God when just your world falls apart? And many people leave God when one bad thing's happened, but for these guys, every bad thing happened, and yet these guys stayed true to God. We don't know how many others there were. They're numberless and they're nameless. But they weren't, Daniel and his three friends were not the only ones. But we only know these guys because they remained, their faith remained. They trusted in God and God gave them a future and he gave them a place in history. So where is God when everything falls apart around you? He's still there. Hang on to him. All right, let's go back to the mountain. What happened on the mountain? I don't know whether you recognize that guy on the left, but a far cry from what you see in front of you now. And where we see those hikers on the mountain is probably about close to the place where we fell. So we had to decide, what are we going to do? For some reason, we lost the inspiration of continuing to climb to the top. We reckon we're about 400 feet from the summit. We were close, but all of a sudden the aim of going to the top evaporated. It was no longer an issue. So what it was decided, well, we'll send a couple down and the rest can just come down slowly. So I was one of the two that went down. And we ran, running down a mountain when you haven't got proper boots, and it was an interesting experience. It took 4 hours to get where we got up to. It took us half an hour, those two of us, to run down. And we found a hut where there was, an official-looking place. So we knocked on the door and says, "Hey, one of our friends has fallen over the bluff just up that valley up there." And they said, "Well, you come with us, and we'll find him." And we just said, "Look, we can't. We're exhausted. Getting down to you to raise the alarm has exhausted both of us." So, but he's up that valley. So these guys went off, and after about 20 minutes of recovery, it might have been a bit longer than that, I started to feel a bit stronger. So I thought, well, at least I'm going to go up there and see what they can find. Not sure what I was going to see. But after 10 minutes of walking up that valley, I saw there was 3 guys, one each side of someone that they were supporting in the middle. And I recognised it was our friend. And he was moving, he was alive. And I thought, wow. And I looked at his cheek, and it looked like his eye was on his cheek. And I thought, oh, that's a bit gross. But as I got closer, it wasn't his eye, it was a bit of cream. They were trying to patch him up a little. What had happened, he had been knocked out in the first few feet of the fall, and the rest of the 100 feet that he fell, his body was limp. So because he was limp, he did not break a single bone in his body. And mind you, his face looked pretty bad. His lips were like balloon tires, just really blown up. And his face was a mess, but the rest of him was fine. He went to the Whanganui hospital. I don't remember if I went in the ambulance with him or not. I just don't remember that part. But after a while, a week or so, he came back to college. He was fine. I met him just recently, in the last year, and I hadn't seen him since that time. And he was looking good. And I'm thinking, at the time I thought, where is God? And God was there all the time, looking after our friend, making sure that he survived that incredible fall. Well, there's one more story I want to refer to. Where is God when you feel forsaken by him? Remember this story? Matthew 27 and verse 46, when Jesus cried out to God, "Where are you, God? My God, why have you forsaken me?" Why did Jesus say that? Because he was carrying at that point all of your sins and all of mine and all of everybody else's, and it was such a weight that he could not see God. It was just as if he had been completely cut off from God, which is what sin does. It cuts people off from God. And if you're cut off from God, that means you have to face this world by yourself, and good luck to you, because it doesn't end well. But with God there, we can get through. He is going to make sure of that. He's prepared a place for us. He expects us to be there. But the fact that Jesus said, "Where are you?" Why? When you feel forsaken by God, you can know that God has already suffered that for you so that you never have to. You never have to say, "Where are you, God?" because Jesus suffered that abandonment so that we never have to. All right, let's look at it. When God's timing seems slow, he is there. When we are running from past mistakes, he is there. When we are wrongly accused, He is there. When we are born into oppressive circumstances, He is there. When we're trapped by countless enemies, He is there. When threatened by leaders, He is there. When your loved ones are threatened, He is there. When your world collapses around you, He is there. And when you feel forsaken by God, He is still there, because Jesus died to redeem us from all of that. And my prayer for you is that you might recognize that and respond. very thankful that at every moment of our lives you are there for us. And as a result, may we always keep in mind this hymn of trusting you, whatever happens, and obeying you, even though it doesn't seem the right thing to do, because our human nature always leads us away from you. But Lord, we thank you so much that you are much more consistent with us than we are with you. Please forgive us for that. But help us to determine in our hearts this week to have a good week with you, to search you out, because when we search, that's when we find. Thank you, Lord, for loving us, for putting all on your shoulders when Jesus died, that we might never need to face those same kind of horrible options of not having God anywhere near us, but being abandoned by him. Lord, thank you that we are never abandoned by you and that you are there all the time for us. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.